Um, and with that, I am thrilled, and I better get to the right spot, to introduce my first speaker. And she's Dr. Ellen Dunham-Jones is going to be followed by Eric Mink from the Netherlands. So we have both a US and European panel today. And then finally, Dr. Regina Klulau. And with that, I'll introduce Ellen. And she is she directs the Master of Science in Urban Design and hosts the Redesigning Cities podcast series at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is an authority on sustainable suburban redevelopment, and she maintains a unique database of over 2,000 retrofits and was recognized in 2017 by Planet Edison as one of the 100 most influential urbanists. She's a co-author with June Williamson of the award-winning Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Solutions for Redesigning Suburbs, and earlier this year, she published Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Strategies for Urgent Challenges, and she's finishing up the forthcoming Best Practices for Improving User Experience in AV Shuttles. I'm exhausted just reading that list and really impressed. Ellen, I hope you will put on your video and share your screen. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation today.
Fantastic. It's not letting me open my video. It says the host has to do it. But thank you, Becky.
All right, well, get that started.
I'll wait for the host to share my video. It has been a terrific conference so far. I'm delighted to share some of my research and initial thoughts about why this audience in particular, I think, should start thinking a lot more and more optimistically about suburbia. And I'll start by sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do that without, yes, I can do the share screen without showing myself here. So I hope everyone can see that. As Becky said, I maintain the world's only database that tracks, or at least attempts to, sustainable changes to suburban form. The parking lot dominated sites and standalone buildings, whether in cities or in suburbs, but the fact is they're most prevalent in suburbia. My co-author and I have published these 2 books documenting how dead malls, aging office parks, strip corridors have either been redeveloped and urbanized, re-inhabited with more community-serving uses, or regreened into parks and reconstructed wetlands. And honestly, it's happening even faster than we can fully keep up. There's way more than 2,000 out there, but that's how much we've got in the database. Suburbia is changing really dramatically. The demographics, increasingly the physical form, are just not the stereotype that we all are all too familiar with. And what I think is really important is, suburbia in the US, it's where the majority of people, the majority of jobs are, as well as it's where the most segregation, the most people in poverty, the most problems of obesity, and the most loneliness, just amongst many of the kind of problems that suburbia is facing. If you really want to impact equity and health, you should be working in the burbs. It's also, obviously, home to the most carbon-producing lifestyles and the most number of trips. So again, in the US, if you are interested in addressing problems, and these problems, and you're not dealing with suburbia, you're kind of ignoring the bulk of the problem. And I would argue that the bulk of the solution really has to kind of lie in what we also do in, how we also take so much of what we're doing in the downtowns, but also start doing it more in suburbia. Now, suburbia has been the testing ground for various forms of autonomous mobility, from Google cars to Waymo. Fully 1/3 of AV shuttle projects those that were operating for more than 2 weeks pre-pandemic were located in the suburbs. I'm showing here Peter Calthorpe's proposal to address the Bay Area's housing crisis by rezoning 45 miles of El Camino Real and serving it with autonomous shuttles so that 250,000 new residents could live without a car. Oops, let me not go back. Let me go back. I can figure out how. There we go. It's just going forward. I can't see my screen to go back. Oh dear. It's okay. Thanks. Sorry about that. Are e-commerce and TNCs also rampant in suburbia? You bet. Not as much MaaS, and that's really, I think, quite dearly needed. So, but today, what I'm really proposing is that suburbia is at a pivot point, and it needs all of our imaginations and brains more than ever. And part of the reason is because suburbia, and that really does, again, mean most of us, has both the most to lose and the most to gain from a tele-everything world. Now go to that next slide. There we go. Since the pandemic started, a study has shown that we're spending 25% more time online. That study rather weirdly counted 31-hour days. I won't get into the details, but argues that the average US adult is spending 16 hours a day online. I thought it was only me. While none of us expects to continue to spend every waking hour online, I do think that one of the most significant legacies of the pandemic impacting how we shape our future built environment will be the tele-everything world. And while the current impacts of telework, teleeducation, online shopping, socializing have been highly inequitable, caused tremendous stress, and devastated the social and economic life of our cities, what might we see in the future? Increases in AVs and e-commerce may well increase our online time, our independence from place and community, our distance from reality. What might that reality look like? More abandonment of aging, broken places as wealth sprawls further out and the divide between rich and poor people and places expands. The pandemic has already accelerated exurban growth and environmental degradation. More sprawl and fewer main streets will serve e-commerce well, but will also mean more reliance on private cars instead of shared rides. AVs will likely increase zero passenger trips, further worsening congestion, especially in the suburbs, and public health. I mean, I can't help but I think, and many others have drawn the comparisons to what the movie Wall-E. One can imagine, don't want to, but can imagine that poor suburban communities especially might be tempted to sell their streets to TNCs to cover the maintenance costs required so that AVs can really operate smoothly. They might have to be bombarded with ads. I mean, there's just so many nightmares that we can imagine as the gulf between rich and poor possibly widens. This photo shows Easter services at a suburban church last year in Atlanta during the pandemic, of course. To me, it sadly captures how fear caused us to use our cars as a further layer of fortification. I think sadly, a world where that divide between rich and poor gets exaggerated and accelerated could just further exacerbate that fear of strangers and ultimately the fear of cities. Now, I know I'm being hyperbolic, but I want to contrast it with another possibility that reverses the outcomes. And I'll start with a little story. In the early day, I taught at MIT in the 90s, and that was the early days of the internet. And my computer geek friends seriously believed, and we would argue about, we don't need cities anymore. Life online is so much more empowering. I have more friends online than I know my neighbors. Well, that was in the 90s, throughout the 90s. Kind of what happened? The more time we spent online, the more cities bloomed. The 2000s have been the renaissance for not all cities, but for most of them. In fact, they've actually been so successful that cities now are often ludicrously expensive. I think that the more time, as we go look to the future, the more time we spend on screen in the tele-everything world, the more we will crave that our off-screen time is spent building community in really great urbanism. Beautifully designed public spaces that feed our human need to see and be around other people and build the kind of localism and trust that makes cities function well. The upper rendering is from Sidewalk Lab's failed Quayside project. They also believed that the tele-everything world called for a vibrant public realm, but they kind of missed the point on the need to build trust. Their privacy issues surfaced. Now, so that's part of what I think. I hope that as tele-everything becomes more ubiquitous, in-person services will become more valued. So the teachers, the healthcare workers, hospitality workers, food services, artists that provide experiences that we cannot get online, and all of the essential workers, the majority of them women, really deserve to be paid higher wages that reflect the value of those services. So, and finally, what I want all of us to really work on is the potential for tele-everything to even the playing field between rich and poor places and the services that they offer. In the very near future, schools in disadvantaged or remote neighborhoods might partner local teachers with more specialized teachers via Zoom into their classrooms that otherwise couldn't offer advanced instruction. Similarly, telemedicine can dramatically improve access to healthcare. Again, evening those property values that are often so incredibly dependent on the quality of education and healthcare nearby. Such access, coupled with telework, would enable more households to choose to live in more affordable, more convenient locations, while at the same time dampening demand for excessive housing costs in cities. We've already seen some of this occur, but it should level off once schools reopen. Okay, I'm gonna start my video now. In my opinion, we should welcome the greater affordability and sustainability overall of a more equitable, polycentric region with more local walk bike trips and shorter transit trips between centers. And I'm going to argue that the time to act is now. Why would we want suburbia to return to quote unquote normal with the normal patterns of segregation that have so characterized it, the unsustainable lifestyles that it tends to support? The American Rescue Plan, and hopefully a follow-up infrastructure plan, provide the biggest opportunity yet we've ever had to overcome the digital divide and invest in much needed social infrastructure. And obviously that's incredibly critical if the tele-everything is going to be for everyone. It's also the time to fundamentally rethink what economic development looks like in the face of declining sales tax revenue, deferred maintenance costs of low density infrastructure. Now is the time to make the case that the suburbs can't afford to be just so suburban anymore. And by the way, to keep those urban migrants who've recently moved out to the Zoom burbs, the suburbs are going to have to start providing some urban amenities, because those were folks who actually liked an urban lifestyle. They just needed more space. But this isn't really, This isn't really about cities versus suburbs and the seeming war between them. That's a zero-sum game. What I'm proposing is that we take advantage of tele-everything to retrofit our physical surroundings to combat isolation and inequity everywhere in cities, suburbs, and rural areas. Now, for 25 years, I've been researching real examples of retrofits of suburban form, low density, parking lot dominated places. Um, my co-author and I just published our second book on the topic in January, documenting 32 case studies addressing not only public health and equity, but climate change, competing for jobs, supporting an aging population. I mean, all of the pre-pandemic challenges are just as essential today. I'm going to zip through some of them as a way to try to show you some of the steps we're already making to retrofit our physical world to benefit from the tele-everything world.
Ellen, we can't see your slides. I think you stopped sharing. If you can reshare.
Oh my goodness. How did I stop sharing? I somehow have gotten onto, yeah, I shared my video. Is that what suddenly happened?
No, it stopped later on. So if you can try to share screen again.
I will absolutely do that. Okay.
No worries, no worries.
All
there you
right.
go. It's coming through. Perfect. That works.
So I was showing the cover of the book and that there is a discount code, which hopefully is now in the chat.
We can put that in the chat.
Yeah. So job one is retrofitting dependence on the automobile. There are so many great case studies and strategies, all of which, like David Zipper's mundane mobility, are essential in order to enable shared AVs, MaaS, and et cetera to work in suburbia. This is just one example of the densification of the suburbs. This is a 30-acre strip mall called now re-densified, mixed use, very walkable, great ground floor, even great roofscape that sits along the 8 to 10 lane Rockville Pike Highway. And okay, but that little 30-acre strip mall, which I'm circling here, hope you can see, is just one piece of a 400-acre insertion of a network of walkable public streets onto private property, paid for in part by the property owners in exchange for higher density. And at the same time, so the private sector is helping to absolutely urbanize these projects. The public sector is putting Rockville Pike, the highway, onto a road diet down to 6 lanes with bus rapid transit running down the center to expand access to the nearby metro station. And that's still not all. That 400 acres is part of a 4-mile-long retrofit of Rockville Pike into a corridor city, transferring trips from the highway to the transit line. It's doing, I think it's a great example of regional scale change, or at least, urban scales change. And at the same time, they're doing a fantastic job at the pedestrian scale. So this is a really ambitious example of that kind of change of reducing automobile dependence. Now, water and energy resilience is also so important. We must address climate change, and through that, build the kind of energy resilience needed for the tele-everything world. Again, there's lots of strategies covered in the book. I'm just going to show one quick case study. In Meriden, Connecticut, a sort of working class town, in the 70s, they built a mall right on top of the creek, right in the middle of their downtown. We did a lot of that in the 70s. It's been flooding like mad, flooding the whole downtown, really devastating. It's finally now, they demolished the mall and daylit the creek and created the site into a stormwater park that's designed a little bit like a bathtub that now holds all of the stormwater. They've removed 227 downtown properties from the floodplain and really attracting new growth. So really a terrific example. And finally, I close with this challenge. Because it's really what I see as the most threatened by autonomy, e-commerce, and tele-everything. We need to leverage social capital for equity. Super briefly, we need great public spaces, we need to expand affordability, and we need to add social infrastructure, often through re-inhabitation. This is an example of one of many malls that have become ethnic community hubs. And the subdivision of a junior anchor store into 140 small stalls that has replaced a single chain store with now 140 immigrant entrepreneur businesses and Spanish-speaking services that really serves that local community. My last example is the Mosaic District here, where the redevelopment of a dead cinemaplex into a mixed-use town center was done with an explicit focus on addressing the loneliness epidemic. It's a fascinating story in the book, and it does happen to be the first use of an AV shuttle in Northern Virginia to provide last mile service to the metro station. So I'm closing with the pandemic is just rapidly accelerating the number of dead commercial sites out there. Developers, venture capitalists, they're on a shopping spree. I hope you'll join me in trying to exploit tele-everything to retrofit suburbia to be more just, more resilient, and prosperous. And we have lots of opportunities to do that. So with that, thank you very much.
Ellen, thank you. That was really great. Sorry about the tech there, but you did a fabulous job. And we did get one question in the comments, and it's definitely something that I think about. I've noticed, and I think we've had some conversations with folks, and just kind of reflecting on the often the central business district still is kind of dead, but when I go to my neighborhood business district, gosh, and it's Portland and we're coming out of winter and there's a halfway sunny day or it's just drizzling and not raining, people are so excited to get outside. And so we're definitely seeing folks going, where they can walk to, they can get out of their house and walk to. But the question really asked was, are we paying attention to the things that we should? And, and people pay attention to what you can measure. And so you mentioned it in one of your slides that, we really need to think about the equity related issues. Are we making our suburbs and other locations, are we thinking about the equitable issues? Are we making sure that there's that safe infrastructure, people can walk or bike? Can they actually take transit? And so we're going to get this huge influx of cash. Like if you controlled that, how would you think about really designing these suburbs? What are some additional things that you would focus on first, just with the information that's available or with the resources that are available?
Well, we really have a lot of knowledge about equity in the suburbs as far as just, what happened, the suburbs are so much more diverse than the stereotype, but they're still highly segregated and poverty is still highly concentrated in certain suburbs. It's not as if, it's just all one homogeneous kind of mix that is now getting more diversified. So I think it's really especially essential in the suburbs to target money where it's really most needed. And it is especially, I think some of these pockets of poverty in the suburbs are still fairly low density. And so it's really hard to provide services. It's really hard to get, it's harder than it is in a downtown, often to provide things. So I'm especially keen on the Wi-Fi, just expanding broadband access and devices and education and training in using them. We have one of the things in the book, the 32 case studies, we were really deliberate about showing a range of market conditions as well as a range of projects across the country in different climatic conditions. And because the responses are always going to should be very targeted to the specific needs, but the kinds of things that you can do in a hot market and the kinds of things you can do in a much slower, maybe even stagnant market are very different, and we need to do all of them.
Yeah, that's related to another question, really about safety and security. How do you think that suburban communities should really be addressing safety and security as they're thinking about and doing retrofits?
So on the one hand, there's certainly the safety issues with cars. It's, hey, slow down the speeds. If we could, argue for reducing the actual size of some of these vehicles, all the same arguments that you would make in downtowns, frankly. So there's a lot of attention to, I think, the pedestrian bike crosswalks, all of those same things that you would look at in cities, but in fact are often on higher speed roads when you're out in the suburbs, and require sort of still additional attention. I think that the other safety issues that we see are, concerns about the role of gated communities, the role of gates in general. They certainly kill the kind of trust levels on building social capital. We do show one example in the book where actually with the putting in of gates was a good thing because of how it simply separated out access to the garages instead of access to the streets in an area that had a lot of high crime. And so really targeted specific kinds of things that sometimes one can do to look at things. I think the other issue of safety that we hear about, the concerns, and it's not really, I don't know, I think, but it's the fear of renters. And cities are much more used to renters and comfortable with it. And I think there's a lot the suburbs could be learning from that. But a lot of suburban communities are still very afraid of renters, partially for crime, but mostly just they think that it'll bring down property values. And yet the biggest trends right now are the construction of single family home rental communities. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, I think, to really look. We try to help, I think, with the book, just showing these examples, try to kind of help educate local folks for serving on planning boards and things, that the demographics have changed so much. Their kids can't afford to live in the same suburb anymore. It's time to get over trying to somehow preserve your suburban neighborhood in amber, assuming that the same household that looked like you when you moved in 40 years ago is really coming back.
Great. Ellen, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate your presentation today and look forward to watching it again after the event. Thank you so much. So now we get to go from Georgia to Europe, and I'm thrilled to introduce Eric Mink. He started his career working at the Ministry of Finance in the Netherlands, where he worked on the introduction of the euro and on integration of financial markets and banking supervision. In 2005, he began working for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, where he worked on contracts for public transport operators and started a major program on rail safety. Since 2017, he's been the program manager for the 7 national mobility as a service pilots in the Netherlands. Welcome, Eric, and I'm going to share your presentation now.
Thank you so much. Tele-everything. I think we're almost there, actually. I started off this today with the European Commission at the Florence Forum in Italy. I'm currently in The Hague in the Netherlands, and also addressing you all in Portland. But all jokes aside, of course, we are not there yet. It's just the internet. There's no teleportation yet, but mobility could be much more efficient and optimized. And I think mobility as a service is a tool in order to organize all of this. And I'd like to see that we optimize mobility via the data that apps can provide also to governments. It's all about level playing field, public-private partnerships, and data sharing, in my opinion. And of course, on optimizing on equity, but also on sustainability, livability, etc., etc. I am program manager for the National Mobility as a Service pilots in the Netherlands, and I will take all of you in all the issues that we have seen in Europe and especially in the Netherlands. We started 7 national pilots, public-private pilots. And in the next slide, the principles that we have addressed are shown. When we started 4 years ago, nobody knew what mobility as a service really was. And all we knew was that platforms, internet platforms, always have negative externalities. So even though all the companies told us that mobility as a service would make the world better, even leading to world peace, we really wanted to closely monitor what happened as governments, and we try to monitor that all the time by data sharing agreements, by standardization, by level playing field requirements, all regarding our national pilots. And in exchange, 7 parties after public tendering get a 20 million subsidy in order to learn together what the impact, what the possibilities and risks of mobility as a service are. In the next slide, the 7 national pilots are addressed, and each and every pilot has a separate target group and a separate public goal attached to it. So we are looking at social inclusion, we are looking at livability, sustainability, reducing of traffic jams, international traffic, etc., etc. The Netherlands is not that big. It's 17 million residents. It's very flat, and we have many bikes. But these pilots have been tendered, and companies are ready to launch their apps, but waiting until the end of COVID, because at the moment we are in lockdown, and as government we cannot have public-private apps asking people to travel. I was really inspired by Jana Saussure. She's a scientist from Sweden who has this 4 level of mobility as a service. And in the next slide, that is, how do you say that? That's explained, and there's apps just for the own company, but if planning, booking, and payment are integrated for all of the for many mobility providers, then we are in mobility as a service level 3. But ideally, MaaS is also a tool to steer on policy goals, and that is called mobility as a service level 4. In the Netherlands, we are aiming at level 4. And in order to do that, we tendered the 7 pilots. In the next slide, there's a short description of all of the parties that have won pilots so far. So we have 8 pilots, 8 apps for 7 pilots, because in one region, 2 parties have won. And we are really keen to see what will happen when these apps go live. What may be special for many people not living in Europe is that your own car and your own bike are also part of the app. So that may be very important because multi-modality can be helped in that way. What struck me during the 4 years that we are working on mobility as a service now is that that governments really are asked to help with standardization of data exchange. One example is in the next slide, but I think we have worked with private parties on 3 or 4 standards now. And one of these standards is called TOMP API, or Transport Operator Mobility Provider, or MaaS-program API. It is based on an open API that already existed, the Global Bike Feed Specification. And it is accepted in many parts of the world right now. And we are really keen on standardization. Preferably private standardization, but it is necessary to have standards in regulations as well. I think standardization leads to ecosystems, and ecosystems prevent a winner-takes-all end game. So it's all about public-private cooperation. In the next slide, I think I witnessed with some researchers from a Dutch institute when they researched mobility as a service and shared mobility across the world, that some countries or cities started out with private governance, some started out with public governance, but now everyone is, how do you say this? I'm sorry, is I think converging towards some kinds of public-private models. And that may be because mobility as a service is too complex, too many players are involved, too many market parties are involved. But I think also some companies really want to make a difference, really want to make more sustainability happen, and really are willing to work with governments in order to achieve this. 3 years ago, I hardly met with parties that really wanted this, but currently everybody is getting acquainted to this new cooperative model, and we even started to work on round tables in order to see what else is needed in the ecosystem. In the next slide, you see that we have started a round table, and at this round table, we are also discussing issues like regulation for the future, on the data exchange, on standardization, on shared mobility. Not just because governments want this, but also because the market players see the need for this. So all in all, I think we are going towards more like commons or cooperative structures. I see this not just in the Netherlands, but all across the world. Is everything perfect then? No, it isn't. Winner takes all is not something just from Silicon Valley players. In Europe, public transport operators are not too keen to share data. I stressed a couple of times that private parties are more willing to share data than some years ago. In the next slide, we have some obligations in the Netherlands for public service operators that they have to fulfill by 2022. So our train operators, bus operators, metro operators, they have to resell their ticket offers to mobility as a service apps. They can't discriminate, they have to be transparent, etc., etc. And this will all be applied in the 30 or so public service contracts that we have in our country. And well, this morning I was in discussion with the European Commission whether this could also be applied on a European scale. As I stressed before, level playing field is very important. It's very important that as governments, we understand what the impact is of mobility as a service. Our pilots will start as soon as lockdown is over in the Netherlands. In the next slide, we indicate how we will learn as governments in the Netherlands what the impact of MaaS is going to be. So in the slide, the next slide, please. You see that the data exchange from mobility as a service apps goes to a common data space, a learning environment where we, together with researchers, will analyze the data and are expecting in a few years' time to be able to optimize mobility on all the public goals that we want. So in this dashboard, we can try to optimize and to minimize peak hours, for example, to optimize carbon dioxide, etc., etc. In the next slides, there's some clarification on this. We will get all kinds of reports. We will try with data scientists to see how we can change consumer behavior, not fully public, not fully private, but in a public-private cooperation, so that neither of us will become a big brother. And yeah, I think optimizing is very, very important if we would like to have a future mobility that is carbon neutral, unless we get into the teleportation feasibility, but that's probably some decades ago from now. We are looking, in my last slide, we really were looking at optimization and changing consumer behavior pre-COVID. And pre-COVID, my minister was quite skeptical about this. So having less cars at peak hour or having a higher occupancy rate on average in cars or in public transport, she thought that consumer behavior could never change. But after COVID, we all do believe that consumer behavior, travel behavior can be changed. It only takes 1 or 2 press conferences from our Prime Minister. And this is really, there's really momentum to try to steer on real-time optimization of mobility via MaaS. And I hope to be able in 1 or 2 years' time to show you the results of our national program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I hope you're an optimist, and that teleportation might happen sooner than you think, or not. So I've got a question for you, and it really kind of boils down to the appropriate roles for both the public sector and the private sector. And of course, you're trying to corral all these different private, both the mobility providers and the app developers to provide this service that you're paying attention to, and that's increasing the mobility and access, for all the things that people need. And so what do you, especially as, a European, what do you think the ideal role of governments in all of this really is?
I really think that we are going towards a new economic state, and it's not just about growth anymore, but it's also about social welfare, welfare economics, I think we call it in the Netherlands, where also sustainability, social inclusion, etc., come into play. We see that more and more companies are trying to achieve this, also because of social development goals. Of course, I am an optimist, but it is hard work. It is about really understanding what you're talking about, and it is a multi-dimensional game. Public policy on mobility is mostly focused on just trams or just metros or just roads. But the data and mobility as a service make it possible to optimize on multiple skills, on multiple modalities. But then you need the data, you need to understand the data, and you need to sit together with all the parties. And this is what we are currently doing, and well, it's going quite well. but I still don't know whether we will be able to have the data and to optimize on the data. So that's really the tricky question.
Right.
Hopefully proof will be in the pudding within 6 months' time. Yeah,
I do love pudding. I mean, this is all a great example of just how complicated some of these things really are. And so one of the questions we've got is just how do you think the Netherlands is going to steer optimized travel through MaaS? Is it going to be through price signals or just providing the information?
Yeah.
Listing in order to meet your public goals? Like if you want to, really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, are you going to be, the walk, the bike, the transit options first? Like, how are you going to do that?
That's a good question. I'm an economist, and I always believed that pricing would be the best thing to do. But I have also studied behaviorism or behavioral economics, and I think that there are many possibilities to have positive behavioral change. For example, giving people free coffee if they don't ride during peak times. Yeah, but we really tried this in the Netherlands, and we tried hundreds of things. and this is what we really have very serious discussions about with industry, because if we will be able to increase the average occupancy rates of public transport, then that coffee is not too expensive, because with an average occupancy rate of 30%, if you are able to increase that to 35 or 40%, the sunk costs were made anyway. But you don't need to build new infrastructure. You won't have additional carbon dioxide. And there are tons of examples like this. We can motivate people to stay at home 1 or 2 days a week, etc. So yeah, these are the tools we are looking at.
Eric, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'll let you start your weekend now. And
I have to go to my minister now. So
all right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Regina Klulau, who is the CEO and co-founder of Populus, a platform for cities to manage the future of mobility. Regina has over a decade of experience in transportation, having served as a research scientist and lecturer at Stanford, UC Berkeley, and UC Davis. Prior to forming Populus, Regina was the Director of Business Development and Strategy at RideScout, an early mobility as a service aggregator that was acquired by Movil and Daimler and BMW's Mobility Services Unit. Regina's been named a 40 under 40 by Mass Transit Magazine and the San Francisco Business Times. She's got a PhD in transportation energy systems from MIT. Welcome, Dr. Clewlow.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm going to go ahead and try to do my screen share. Is that working for folks?
Okay. Yes, it
Yeah,
sure
that works.
is.
Great. Well, thank you. First off, I'd like to thank the Urbanism Next team for the honor of speaking at this event. They've done such a great job of transitioning this community to a virtual forum, and I'm just glad to be part of it here today. I'm going to be speaking on a topic that I've been thinking about for the past decade in various roles, previously as mentioned as a transportation research scientist, and more intensely really for the past 3 years at Populus. And that is the humble curb, how its use cases are changing, the semi-recent introduction of mobility data, and how cities are managing their public right-of-way with more resilience and flexibility. Although today, with many of us still working from home, it probably feels like a million years ago that Uber and Lyft first began delivering commercial services on city streets. It was really only in 2010, though, that Uber delivered its first trip in San Francisco. But obviously, in retrospect, these services grew very, very quickly, from hundreds of rides to, I believe, Uber's highest reported trip volume of 1.9 billion rides in Q4 of 2019. And to put that in perspective, across the entire United States, there were 9.9 billion transit rides in 2019 for the entire year. There are other changes in the transportation landscape that I'll also touch on, but what I think is most important to recognize about ride hailing is that it introduced travel patterns that are quite different from how city streets and more specifically curbs were initially designed to be used, which is for parking probably too many vehicles. And what they've done is they've changed travel patterns, including more frequent pickups and drop-offs that can conflict with other modes, including buses, personally owned vehicles, that typically don't stop in the same manner, and then more troubling from a safety perspective, cyclists. While Uber and Lyft rapidly grew with a lot more controversy, there was a pretty dramatic growth of other services happening a bit more quietly. And by that, I mean, of course, commercial delivery. From package delivery services such as UPS to Amazon, we've also seen really huge growth in on-demand food delivery as well, which have obviously been accelerated by the pandemic. Towards the end of 2017, another more controversial service was introduced, and I'm of course referring to dockless scooters. I started Populus towards the end of 2017, in large part because I had a sneaking suspicion that dockless mobility, and in my mind, that would have meant dockless bike share, which had already exploded in China, would arrive in the US. But instead, by the grace of US innovation and venture capital dollars, they morphed into scooters in the US context. And in a way, they were actually much more controversial than perhaps if they had been bikes. When micromobility arrived, many cities then said, after they'd seen waves of change as fleets of services were arriving in cities, okay, this is our time now to get things right when it comes to mobility management and deciding what we want the rules of the road and our curbs and our sidewalks to be. In 2017 and 2018, largely motivated by dockless micromobility, cities began introducing the concept of mobility data sharing. It really initially started with requirements to share spreadsheets, CSV files of trip and vehicle data by the Seattle Department of Transportation and DDOT in Washington, D.C., where many dockless bike share operators had already arrived in 2017. But that later gave birth to data specifications that enabled the sharing of real-time information about shared mobility vehicles. And today, we can now facilitate two-way communication between cities and mobility operators, where mobility operators share data about how their vehicle locations are located on city streets and property. And cities, using, for example, the Populus platform, can share new policies about equity deployment zones, parking, and specific curb policies back to operators in a digital form. I could dive deep into the data weeds and go deeper into this topic of mobility data standards. Heidi from Mobility Data does a much better job of it. But if you missed her session, I'll just highlight a few of the key data standards that have been most critical to facilitate mobility management. So GBFS, the General Bike Share Feed Specification, has been around for a while. It was introduced really with bike share systems that were procured by cities and shares real-time information about available micromobility vehicles. It has been extended to dockless scooters, as well as in many cases is used for mopeds. But fundamentally, it isn't necessarily used in a compliance or regulatory framework. It's really meant to surface vehicles so that they can be seen in mobility as a service applications. The second data standard that's important to be aware of is the Mobility Data Specification. What's interesting about the Mobility Data Specification, or MDS, is that it enables cities to see real-time and historic information about all vehicles, whether or not they are available to riders, as well as granular trip data to help plan for transportation purposes and policy and planning. The other interesting element of MDS is that it also has more recently introduced standards for cities to share policies with operators. And I'll provide a few examples of what those specific policies typically look like. And then lastly, when you look at the curb specifically, Shared Streets, which was born out of NACTO several years ago, introduced Curb LR, which helps cities standardize how their curb regulations are managed and can be shared with external parties. What mobility data has really given rise to is a paradigm shift in how cities have been able to manage mobility services, in particular fleets of commercial vehicles for both passenger and delivery, as they continue to make up an increasingly large portion of vehicles using the public right-of-way. With mobility data, cities have been able to more effectively play a key role as mobility managers. They can see real-time information about vehicles parked in the public right-of-way, obtain historical insights from trip data so they can determine where to place new infrastructure or policies. But fundamentally, without data, many cities were essentially blind to how their streets, curbs, and sidewalks were being used by new fleet services. With data, they're now empowered to create policies and more quickly establish new infrastructure to build towards transportation that's cleaner, that's safer, and that's more equitable. So using dockless scooters as an example, but you can imagine this framework being applied to other transportation modes and services. I'd like to highlight how many cities that we work with at Populus are managing their mobility programs with their software, which allows them to receive data from operators as well as share new policies with operators. A key use case, particularly in micromobility, is many cities put in place policies that prescribe how many vehicles each operator can place in the public right-of-way. So typically in the form of a vehicle cap, But also, as many cities recognize, there are historic systemic inequities in how transportation services are delivered. Many cities are also now able to, as new services arrive, begin to ensure that they are equitably available to their communities. And then finally, parking policies are a very common use case for mobility management platforms. Second, when data does come into a platform, many cities do also use it historically to help evaluate what policies are working and which ones aren't. Are they actually achieving the goals that they have set out to achieve when it comes to transportation safety, equity, and sustainability? And then lastly, and what is really promising is that we also see a lot of cities more able to leverage data to adapt the public right-of-way. In the micromobility context, what that means is that we provide data through Populus to cities, as well as to many transportation planning firms such as Alta and Tool, who are able to then more quickly update bike master plans, many of which were established before scooters arrived and before millions of more people were using that infrastructure, to update those plans so that there is more expanded protected infrastructure to allow smaller sustainable modes to grow. In a very strange way, what has resulted with mobility management is that the most sophisticated digital mobility management solutions that cities leverage are in fact being applied to the dockless scooter. On the left, you can see a pane with historic scooter parking events. The county of Arlington, pretty early on after the arrival of scooters, put in place micromobility corrals or virtual parking docks. And then through Populus, cities can now share these policies digitally with operators, and they can then natively present that information to their riders. Restricted parking is another common use case. For example, if the Pentagon is a no parking zone for scooters, what most operators would then do, particularly if they have to pay any fees or fines for vehicles being parked there, is they will geofence that area so that a rider is actually unable to end their ride in that no parking area. Otherwise, they continue to incur fees. So looking back at our past presenters, comments on the economics of transportation and what kind of policies and tools can be utilized, I think this is a really interesting example of how cities are already using pricing and hopefully soon incentives in order to steer things in the direction that they want. So while many of the examples I've provided for mobility management have focused on micromobility, what is really most important to recognize is that there are in fact a lot of competing use cases for the public right-of-way, including by much larger, more space consuming, more dangerous, and more polluting vehicles. Populus has rapidly expanded our mobility management platform to not just empower cities to manage scooters and bikes, but also shared mopeds, which usually park at the curb, car sharing vehicles, obviously also parking at the curb, and now commercial fleet delivery. This past year has obviously brought into stark view for many people the way that we choose to allocate public spaces in cities. I'm sure as part of the Urbanism Next forum, I'm preaching to the choir. I assume that many of you, like me, have dedicated your careers to working with cities to forge paths to allocate more space to people and not to cars. But what's been interesting is that now we see more people, citizens beyond urban planners, citizens that are beyond presidents of bike coalitions. Those other citizens are also asking, why aren't we allocating more space in our cities for cycling, for pedestrians? Do we really need this many lanes for cars? Do we really need to allocate this much space for free parking? When many cities adopted stay-at-home policies a year ago, very immediately after, we saw a number of cities around the world, and increasingly so, such as Oakland and here in San Francisco, dedicate huge amounts of streets to close them to vehicular traffic so that their citizens had more space for biking, walking, and other social distancing activities. When things began to open up a bit more, we then saw the rapid deployment of parklets, or as I prefer to call them, also streeteries. And in many other cities, the complete closure of entire street segments allowed businesses to expand in them. One of the things that I found in talking to cities is that many of them were changing the use cases of their street networks and curbs so quickly that they also needed digital solutions to share new maps with the public, key mobility stakeholders such as mapping platforms. And so those are some of the digital solutions that we added to our platform to enable cities to define where certain street segments should prioritize bikes and pedestrians, and then to also share public-facing maps that citizens could engage with to request new shared streets, slow streets, or provide feedback on ones that were proposed or already in place. The mindset of being flexible and more dynamic about how one's curbs are being used isn't going away. Many of the key conversations that we hear in our work with cities is that, number one, as the world starts to reopen, a lot of cities are embracing micromobility. Many cities are also now thinking about which changes, such as curbside pickup and drop-off, should become permanent. Or at the very least on some sort of recurring basis to better facilitate use of the public right-of-way. Managing commercial loading continues to be a big pain point in many cities. Whether it's an on-demand food delivery vehicle or a scheduled package delivery vehicle, these are huge pressure points on city curbs, and every city is trying to figure out better solutions to allocate and manage that space. So in closing, while there's been this decade-long brew of new mobility services changing how city streets and curbs are being used, over the past couple of years, cities have very much accelerated their thinking on mobility management and their implementation of new policies and adoption of new digital tools that empower them to deliver a future that's more sustainable. Cities are catching up very, very quickly, and I'm more optimistic than ever about what the future holds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. I really appreciate it. So I think like Eric and like a lot of economists, think about we're going to manage demand by affecting supply. And it wasn't until I saw a presentation by the folks at the city of Aspen, where they actually developed an app, and they were collecting both information and doing some pilot projects around access to the curb for their commercial deliveries. And what I found to be just really powerful was, they're getting this information about, about the demand for the curb. And while they did charge for it, it was like a $1 an hour, or it was really cheap. It wasn't enough to really, it wasn't the pricing that was doing it. But they, what was really powerful was they said to their to all the delivery companies is, we're going to make decisions. We're going to make policy decisions and access decisions, and when you can drop, when you can deliver or not, based on the information here. And so if you want to be part of our decision-making process, you've got to participate and be part of the app and actually give us your data. And so, that's just one example of how the public sector is trying to nudge the private sector to give up some of that information so they can make better decisions. Do you see other kind of carrots that that the public sector can use to encourage the private sector to kind of share some of that data?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We think a lot about carrots and sticks at Populus. And I think that one of the really interesting examples that I've talked about that we've seen is that the vast majority of cities across the world, in the United States in particular, have put in place policies that require, if you want to operate a scooter program and deploy a fleet of vehicles, you have to share data and you have to abide by certain policies. I would say, similarly, when it comes to car sharing services, cities are able to compel operators to provide them with data. But in that case, there's actually a little bit more of a carrot as well. We at Populus, for example, receive all the data for car sharing services in cities like Oakland, a number of other Bay Area cities, and then now up in Seattle, we facilitate the data collection from the car sharing service in order to provide the city with information about where they're being parked, and then also, quite frankly, to allow them to invoice for that parking usage. And what they do in Oakland is they actually tell their enforcement officers not to ticket those vehicles. So it's a bit of a carrot in the sense that you can then, with certain fleet operators, if you want to allocate more space to them, make it easy for them to perform their operations, make it, in the case of car sharing, easy for their riders to utilize that service. They've, in that circumstance, provided a carrot and said, we want you to be able to be part of our community to deliver more sustainable options to our citizens. And we're not going to give you tickets, but you need to comply with these rules.
That's actually a really good point. And I know that, like parking fees are tax deductible, but parking fines are not. And so like there's probably a variety of things that are then beneficial to those companies by having that different kind of system. You know, one last question before we break, and this is really kind of around the privacy issue, and again, just kind of thinking about trust. And have you seen some pretty good examples between, you know, our efforts to really build trust between the private sector and the public that has their data and might need to share it? You know, what are they doing to instill that trust with their customers and users and the public sector as well, like that triangular relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated question. And I would say I don't know that I, off the top of my head, could come up with good examples of private sector companies that have developed trust with their writers or users. But I do think that when it comes to cities and their relationship with operators who are delivering them with data, there's been a lot of really good examples of cities putting in place specific privacy policies that really ensure that the data is only being used for the use cases that it is intended. I think you know, the important thing about mobility data is data shouldn't be shared just for the purposes of it being shared, but for specific use cases that the city justifiably has. And you know, there are numerous examples of reasons why that data is important to help change how our city streets are being used and ensure safety and sustainability moving forward.
That sounds great. I feel like I could just keep on asking questions, but I know that we have a few breakout sessions to get to. So with that, Regina, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time this morning and your presentation. And I did want to welcome back Nico Larco, the Urbanism Next Center Director, to say a few last words before we break.
So first of all, great sessions this morning, and have loved that. I just want to say, since this is the last time that we're all going to be together in quotation marks here, just a tremendously thank you for everyone who attended the sessions, the entire conference, to the presenters who came, especially the sponsors and the partners. Been fantastic working with you, and thank you so much for the support. I'd like to thank again UO Conference Services for making this all happen, and an extra big thanks to Becky, Juliet, and Marcia, who made all this work. It's been fantastic. It's been a difficult year, and it's been hard to be online. I think we're all feeling a little bit of the wear of being online so much. I'm tremendously going to look forward to being in person. Last year, the images Becky showed at the beginning there made my heart hurt a little bit. It's so good to be with all of you in person. I look forward to doing that again. I've loved the content throughout the conference. It's been absolutely great. Continue to be taken by the breadth of participants, topics, sectors that we're bringing together in Urbanism Next. It makes me so happy to see all that, and to really look at all the different aspects of what's emerging tech's impact has been on cities and communities. You can see it in the plenaries. You know, we think really hard in the plenaries to try to bring together a diverse set of presentations that get people outside of whatever silos you might end up inadvertently getting in based on what breakout sessions, what concurrent sessions you go to. So I love that we can bring all these topics, you know, everything from data, urban design, mobility to service, freight. Oh my God, that freight presentation, I've still been thinking about that one throughout this entire period. I'll say we are at a critical moment, not in the conference, but in our time, generally what we're living through. Hopefully in the next couple months, we're going to be seeing more and more opening up. And I think there's a really important opportunity here for all of us in setting the trajectory of what post-recovery is going to look like, right? So we've lived through this kind of painful last year. As we open up, there's really a chance to reset a whole lot of kind of the framing of what we're doing and where we're heading. And I think it's really incumbent on all of us to be working on that and to be helping to frame that narrative and set that narrative with all the stakeholders that we work with. I think it's really important that we keep equity and community goals first and foremost. I think that's something we have to continue to keep front of mind all the time. I think the role of government in being nimble, that has been an ongoing theme in so many of the sessions that I've been at the last couple of days. Government, that we should, one of the, we'll say, unfortunate but good opportunities of of COVID is that it's made us understand that the world is changing quickly. And that really gives us, the government, the opportunity, the ability to take on a little bit more risk and to try things. I think that's really important. And another thing that I think has been really pertinent and continued throughout this entire session, all these sessions, has been the importance of trust, of developing trust between the public and private sectors, between communities, between all the different stakeholders, and figuring out how to do that. And lastly, I think we really need to think about the long game in a lot of this, as I mentioned in the very first chat discussion the presentation I did, which is that there's lots to learn. Much of this is really complicated, and we need to be able to pilot, to chip away at that learning, be able to evaluate, pivot, and then recast again. I think that that's something we need to continue to be doing. There's lots to learn, and we need to learn those things together, and importantly, we need to share those things. So we continue to ask and are tremendously thankful for everyone who sends us reports and learnings that they're making, so that we can help amplify those voices and kind of create a forum where we can all talk about this. So I'm looking forward for the rest of today and throughout this coming year. As we say every year, I think these are important times that we're living in, and it's really important that we all put our shoulders into this, really try to affect the trajectory of many of these things, affect how deployment happens, affect how communities are affected, and then share all that information. And I will look forward to seeing you all in person again really soon. Becky, I'm not sure if you had some closing thoughts you wanted to add.
Nope, I'm all done, Nico. Let's go.
All right. We'll see you all in the breakout sessions in just a little bit. Thank you so much.